Oh, the Windows path versus the Bash path. Yes. So Windows exists in a very special space when it comes to doing stuff like this. All these Unix style development tools sprouted up because so many developers, or two reasons. One, so many developers were using Linux, and also Apple decided to go with a POSIX style kernel when they went to OS 10. So as such, Linux and Mac OS suddenly became really compatible at that level from a developer standpoint. Windows decided to go a different route, something that's always irritated me. Early on, Microsoft actually held the rights to a Unix clone called Xenix. And they could have gone that way. They could have taken Xenix and they could have used that to make Windows NT equivalent with, and then everybody would be on a wonderful Unix core. But they didn't. They decided to roll their own Windows NT, and the rest is history. They eventually sold the rights to Xenix, so they don't have that anymore. And now they're trying to do a little bit of catch-up. So this is where all these other things like Cygwin and WSL, especially because that's sanctioned officially by Microsoft. WSL is them saying, okay, we need to get on board with this developer platform and try to make it less painful for people who are using Windows. And it has helped a lot. WSL is a huge step forward over what was there before. But that said, still multiple systems that are working together at the same time that make life interesting. Zach said, yes, some people will not have any issues. I'm going to let somebody else answer that. Maybe Saxon, you didn't have any issues. Did you just stick with command prompt, or did you do it in Bash or WSL, or what configurations you have? Just the command prompt? Cool. While you guys are typing, I'm gonna make up. Remember my sequence of events here. Pip 3, pip install. All right. And we'll get that version 3.7 thing worked out. So yeah, you can just run CMD directly that way. Did you guys do the project? No, you haven't done that yet. Huh. I wonder if we still do this. I'll have to look. Maybe later on, we actually have a project in the CS program where you write your own shell. And then you see that the shell, like the command prompt or bash, is just actually a program that's actually kind of simple. Let's see, pip install. This should give me some pip files. And then I won't bother going to the shell, but inside the pip file, this is where we are saying which version of Python we want. And so if you're getting that error about 3.7, I think you can either change this to require that specifically if you want, or if you just change it to say 3, then it'll use 3 anything, which is probably fine. I'm not sure if you have to do a pip-env install after you change this, but you might have to do that as well. Yeah, so what did this remind you guys of? This pip file and pip file lock. Does that remind you of anything in your past? Yarn and npm, it's certainly analogous, right? So in my mind, when I'm building my computer knowledge up, one thing I do is I look for anything that reminds me of anything else. And so this is what forms my big web of knowledge is, hey, this reminds me of this other thing, and this reminds me of this other thing, and so on. And sometimes it's tools like pipenv and yarn, and other times it's algorithms like, oh, hey, the card shuffling algorithm I know is the same algorithm for finding random permutations of collections of items, stuff like that. But the more of these things you have in your web of knowledge, the better off you'll be when you have to solve some arbitrary problem. Because the more things you have in your brain that arbitrary problem reminds you of, the more tools you have at your disposal to solve it. So one of the goals of the computer science curriculum is to build that web of knowledge by exposing you guys to all kinds of different things that hopefully remind you of other things that you know already. And it's more useful, definitely, if we teach you about something that reminds you of something that's connected somehow. This is why we start with Intro to Python and then move on through this other stuff. It's more useful to do that than it is to just plop you down on an island in the middle of nowhere, saying, here's some stuff that doesn't remind you of anything, that you just have to learn outright. It's always really tricky to do that. All right. Let's see. Did I miss anything back here, question-wise? Any other questions? There must be other questions. I'm glad that it was straightforward. Let me see here. How far did we get? I'll widen it up. Questions not about problems, but questions about Django in particular. This sprint is your best opportunity to stump me, because my Django knowledge isn't that broad. Ooh, examples of complete Django projects. Oh yes, backing up. Raymond, yes, there will be videos every night, and I haven't added them up, but it should be less than an hour, I think, of video stuff. But then following along with the video is going to take, well, I don't know. It depends on how you guys watch them. So some people watch them all the way through and then implement everything. Some people pause them as they go, which probably make it take twice as long or something. But all the videos put together, we try to cap them at 90 minutes. And I don't think the ones for this week are anywhere close to 90 minutes. But if the end of the day happens and I forget to give you videos, like right after the lecture, let me know. I'll do it. They're also all in Training Kit. But it's a little hard to see in Training Kit where one day ends and one day starts. Let me see if I can find a good example of a complete Django project that actually looks like something that isn't just a website. So there are kind of two different ways of doing these Django projects. and both of them are commonly used. Django actually has an entire front-end system, and we don't talk about that during this week. We just concentrate on making a RESTful API with Django. So you can make a website entirely with Django for the front end and the back end. And those aren't single page applications. They're your classic, we're going to jump from page to page and load each one as we get there type of application. And so what a lot of people do for single page apps that use Django is something similar to what we'll do this week, where they'll write a backend using Django that just exposes the REST API. And then they're free to write a different front end, like a single page application that accesses that API. Let's see here. Trying to find something that's not just total eye candy. And actually shows that it's Django. And it would be nice if there was something that had source. I've got a top 10 sites built with Django. Discus, Bitbucket, Instagram, Pinterest, NASA. But that doesn't answer the question of how Pinterest uses it, because certainly Pinterest's website and Instagram have multiple backend systems at work, and Django might be one of them, but it's probably not entirely clear which portion of the project is done using Django. But it's certainly heavy duty enough to run these things. Well, let's think of an example here. This is a good thought process. Let's see, Washington Post, Eventbrite. Let me see if there's a better one here. What's the best one of these as an example? I'm not going to use Pinterest because I never use Pinterest. I don't know how it works. All right, so let's see, Instagram. So in case you're not, I do use Instagram a lot, so I can talk about that one, and I can do some speculation about how it might work. Yeah, multiple frameworks. This is a good topic. I like it. All right, so Instagram, in case you don't know what it is, think Facebook, except you're just posting photographs. That's it. So take a picture with your phone, spruce it up a little bit with their editing tools, and then post it. And then people can follow up with comments and likes and stuff. So it's kind of like a very simplified version of Facebook. And I like it because it tends to be Facebook without a bunch of political posts and just nice, relaxing photographs that people have taken. I say relaxing, but a friend of mine just posted pictures of her injury. She's like, look at my leg. I'm like, that's not relaxing. So we've got this system that does that. And so if you imagine your phone app, the phone app does some things, right? Like it has a user interface where you can go through and look at your pictures. It can access the camera and take pictures with the camera and so on. Normal phone app stuff. But it doesn't actually store all these pictures for you because you want to share those pictures with other people, so they have to be on a server somewhere. So now we have a server component. So one place it could be used within Instagram is to implement a REST API that had certain functionality that was needed to run the site. For instance, like what? What kind of functionality would we need to run a site like Instagram? on a REST API. Be able to search for a photo, yeah, or search for a person's photos. So search functionality, maybe that's one endpoint, maybe that's multiple endpoints. What else might we need? We got to be able to store and create new photos. So we'll have to be able to upload some stuff. We have to be able to authenticate, keep track of our user profiles. So we've got all this different kind of functionality. This is all good stuff. We got image filter stuff. So much stuff. So all this functionality that we see through the app, basically anytime we have something that's shared with other people, that has to go through a server somewhere. And a good way to do that, as you guys know, is to set up a REST endpoint to make that happen. So here's where Django could come into play, because as you'll see this week, setting up a REST endpoint for a certain data model is actually pretty straightforward. There's a lot of boilerplate in Django, like code that you have to write to make it work. And some of it is kind of dense. You'll think like, oh man, this is a lot of lines of code that I'm not entirely clear on what it's doing. But that said, it turns out to be not so many lines of code total to make the whole API, which is kind of nice, especially since you get to define your model in Python just using regular Python code, and then the REST framework automatically will take that Python code, turn it into the SQL code that needs to be stored on the database, and also expose it as a REST API. So this is one way it could be used with Instagram. There's also an Instagram web front end that's kind of cheesy. It's not as featureful, and I'm not sure if that's implemented with Django or not. It's sort of a single page application, kind of. So the gain from Django really is, oh, sorry, I need to look and see how far we watched in videos yesterday. I can't remember now. How far did we get? Watched up through something or another. Up through, the .env stuff. And does that include a I'm getting there. That included making a model, right? We got that far? All right. Awesome. All right, we talked about the migrations, we added the model, and we had a database with a Python shell, and then we set up the env file. All right. We haven't done any SQL anything yet. All right. Cool. All right. Tyson, are we following along with a specific repo? There is a repo that doesn't really have anything in it except the day-to-day stuff, but this is the repo that you can clone for doing PRs and so on. So this repo doesn't have anything in it yet, but if you follow along with the videos, then it will as you build it out. And then in terms of following along, the videos and the training kit actually has all the steps in it for getting that stuff done. Let's see here. I was going to talk about two things. Let me leave a note to myself. Okay. And then along with doing multiple frameworks. I'll get to that too. I've got a whiteboard over here hanging out in outer space. This is where I put all my notes for my stack of things I want to talk about. I do want to back up to what Mark said, multiple frameworks being used in tandem. And there's no reason why we can't do this. But if you guys think about it, what's scary about that? What are some of the things that can go wrong? Because certainly a lot of things can go wrong if you're using multiple frameworks. We've got different languages. This can be a problem from multiple standpoints. Maybe some developers are stronger in one language than another. Maybe a developer decides to write everything using Erlang, and nobody else in the company knows Erlang, and then that one developer quits. Oh, it could be problematic. We got dependencies. Like, what if you have two frameworks that do things slightly differently, but they're dependent on one another? That slight difference in how they get their work done could make those dependencies complex. There are inefficiencies in there. There's a reason why Henry Ford on the assembly line had one employee doing one thing over and over and over again. When you've got a simple single task, then everything moves more smoothly than when you have multiple things you have to do and deal with. They can interfere with one another. Maybe one of the opinionated frameworks wants to do something a certain way, and then when you try to use another framework with it, that framework has its own opinions of how things should be done. And maybe you have to decide at a very basic level, do we want to do things way A or way B? And maybe there's an incompatibility there. So these are all legitimate concerns, but we can mitigate them to a certain extent. What do you I was going to ask, how might we mitigate these problems? What if we did want to use multiple frameworks at the same time? How could we do that and know that we can do it safely or well? Yeah, the hope will be that we have some additional functionality, or that development time will be decreased, or something like that, that we have some tangible benefit. We have to mitigate these risks, though. What can we do to make sure these risks don't come bite us? Good analysis of the opinions, yeah. And so we don't have overlapping functionality too much. Maybe some type of middleware would help smooth things out. As we convert data from the format it needs to be for this framework into the format it needs to be for a different framework. These are all good ideas. Yeah, handle things per framework and not rely on each other. I like this too. There's sort of one overarching umbrella statement that kind of covers all these things we're talking about. Yeah, not causing conflicts. It's make sure that we have one piece of software responsible for its thing and another piece of software responsible for its thing, and there's no overlap between these two responsibilities, so that the frameworks aren't stepping on each other's toes. We sometimes call this a clear separation of concerns. So one framework could be doing one thing entirely, and another framework could be doing something else entirely. And so an example of that we can use right here with this is we can say, okay, Django, the Django framework, you're responsible for implementing the REST API for this project. And that's your responsibility. No one else is going to do REST. You're going to do REST. But we want to put a React front end on this thing. So we're going to use the React framework for the front end. And that's going to be front end responsibility. Django's not going to do front end. React will do front end. React's not going to implement any other stuff that the Django backend would be working on. So that front end back end split, that's a really natural place to say, hey, here's the separation of concerns. Framework A, you're the back end. Framework B, you're the front end. And then you define a interface between these things, the API, the application programming interface. And once you've written down what that interface is, as long as Django speaks the interface on one side and your React app speaks the interface on the other side, then we're all good. So we've separated the concerns of these two things, these two frameworks, and we've defined the interface between them. And then everything should work out pretty well. And I've done that split there on the front end, back end, because viscerally that probably makes more sense. But there's no reason why we couldn't have a similar split just within the back end, right? We might have one server that's responsible for doing the REST API and maintaining a database full of information about users, but that database might not be any good at storing large data like images or videos. Maybe we need a different system out there that actually stores these giant images and videos. And so now we have two systems on the back end. We've got one that's doing the REST API, and another one that's doing large media storage. And again, as long as we decide, hey, you're responsible for large media, you're responsible for this other thing, we define an interface between these two things, then we're all good. And so in your mind, at least in my mind, what I do is I start thinking about these subsystems from an interface standpoint. Which interface do they actually implement? And then the details of the subsystem I don't really care so much about. As long as the subsystem says, hey, I'm going to be exposing a REST API with these endpoints that you can call with these parameters and get this stuff back, then I don't actually care what the backend's written in. It could be Django, or it could be Node or PHP. You know, as long as the interface that I'm talking to stays the same, then they can change the backend out to be whatever they want. Right. Would it still be REST? That seems reasonable to me. REST is a pretty decent way of doing things, especially for simple one-off things like, hey, upload this image. So probably a REST type API, and then you feed in all the image data, and then it's got some backend, some big CDN distributed data store thing, right? Yeah, I like this question, Alex. So API, I'm going to say, is the more general term. The application programming interface, it's used it's pretty widely applicable to all kinds of situations. And REST is one of those specific situations. I'd say one of the common things about an API is that it is well documented. And that's probably about where the similarities between all the different types of APIs ends. So REST APIs, you've seen these before because the documentation consists of what? If we have a documentation for a REST API, what kind of stuff do we have in there? Or if you were going to use one, what would you like to see in there? So we should have all the CRUD stuff. What else? Various endpoints. We need to know what endpoints to put in. Like what kind of JSON we need to pass. Even is it always JSON? Is it other types of data, and so on? So we want to see that kind of documentation for a REST API. Another API might be the Unix sockets API. So the Unix sockets API is how you write Unix programs to transmit data over a network. But that's not a REST API. That's actually a C language API. So it's written in C. And so if you look at, let me just Google, Mouse here live. See what the sockets API documentation looks like. Choosing a page nearly at random here. So another application programming interface. Again, the commonality here is that we have a well-documented way of writing software. And here it's just telling us, hey, these are C functions that you can call in order to use this thing. So here we have a C API as opposed to a REST API. And it's well documented. Hey, we should make this function call, and these are the parameters we need to pass in, and here's what these parameters mean, and so on. So the API is a way of, it's a definition of how you write software to interface with another subsystem. And or I guess it probably also includes the software that actually presents that subsystem, that is that subsystem that you are interfacing with. My offhand definition of API. Wikipedia probably has a much more concise one. Well, whenever you're writing software and you're thinking, hey, here's a system that I have to interface with somehow, a valid question is, what are the API docs for interfacing with this system? Whether that system is a REST system or whether it's just some library that we're using to call into the operating system, or all kinds of stuff. And I am talking a little fast and loose when I say RESTful API. RESTful API has a definite definition. A definite definition. Is there such thing as an indefinite definition? I don't know. But it ties into what Mark said about CRUD. Like RESTful APIs, you're supposed to use the right type of HTTP call, like a delete if you're doing a delete, and so on. And that's like the official definition. But in practical usage, people are a little bit loosey-goosey about it, and pretty much anything that uses HTTP as an endpoint to get something done on the back end, people consider that to be a REST API. Yeah, it's similar to when you write a class and you call its methods. It's like that. I would say that let's say you wanted to implement some functionality that was widely usable by other people. So a common thing to do there would be to take that functionality and write it in a general way that other people can call, and then wrap that up. And like in Python, that would be a module, or are they called modules in Node.js too? What are they called? Node modules, right? Isn't that the directory? So you can wrap them up. So you wrap that functionality up, and then you say, hey, if anybody else wants to use my library, use my code to get this work done, then you can do that. And so in that way, your code becomes an API when you publish it in that way. You say, oh, here you go. Call this to make this happen. Call this to make that happen. And you use those things a lot when you were doing node programming, because you say, okay, oh, I found this interesting package, so I'm going to use yarn install, and I'm going to install this package, and then I'm going to make use of it based on the documentation that the user, the creator of that package has described for me. There's probably an argument to be made that anytime you write software that is intended to be easily reused like that, like installed with pip or installed with yarn, that you're actually writing your own little API there. What does Wikipedia say about APIs? It's getting a little verbose. It's verbose and vague at the same time, just like my definition. That makes me feel a little bit better, I guess. Oh yeah, here we go. Here's a good. I like this line and the following one because it shows kind of the breadth of what an API can be. Documentation, very important. An API without documentation is not useful. Like a room that only has secret doors in it. You got to try to figure it out without being told how to use it. It's really kind of crazy. Oh boy, let's see here. Any more API-ish style questions? API escape rooms. Ooh, Justin, that's not a bad idea for some kind of strange web game. Yeah, so serverless API, we can totally have one of those. It's because the API, it could be for a web-based system like you're used to, but it could be for an operating system or a database. Well, it probably has a database probably has a server attached to it, but it could be for computer hardware. And this is the most common one. A software library is definitely the most common one. So, like with the sockets API for doing network programming in Unix, there's no server running for that. That's just a library of calls that you could make that interface with the operating system. Uh, and indeed, the sockets API is what you use to write servers with. I think later on in the CS program, we have you guys lined up to actually write a web server in C that uses sockets API. So, like I said, the API is it's a very general term, refers to all kinds of stuff. Sometimes it's a server, sometimes it's just a little collection of software that somebody's written. What would be another example? Uh, I'd argue that, yeah, there are tons of iOS APIs for sure. Anything that interfaces with the operating system like that. But then there's a lot of stuff you guys have used in JavaScript that is arguably also like the JavaScript core API, things like math.square root and console.log, stuff like that. That for reasons I don't fully understand in my own head, nobody actually calls that an API, even though it kind of is. It's very strange. Some things are clearly APIs, and other things are not so clearly not APIs. All right. I love it. Without looking at that page, if you haven't gone there yet, what are some of the things that a deck of cards API might have in it for functionality? Shuffle, my favorite. I love shuffle. There's a great shuffle algorithm that I just totally love. Give me the next 10 cards out of the deck. What else might we do? Any casino players in here? Type of game, deal to end players. Yeah. So all these, like the deck of cards, we might not need a server for. I don't know if that API is a REST API or if it's a different kind of API. I haven't gone to the site yet, but a lot of things you don't need a server for. You could just write some code that did a shuffle, right? Casinos typically don't play card games with a single deck either. They usually take a number of decks and they put them in what's called the shoe, and the shoe has multiple decks shuffled into it. So maybe the functionality could be like, hey, I need a 10 deck shoe, please. Build a house of cards. That's a great Easter egg. Yeah, we could do all kinds of stuff like that. Exactly. Awesome. Shuffle's a fun algorithm. This is totally an aside. I wasn't going to talk about this at all, but uh, in fact, I'm not going to talk about it. But think about if you had an array of cards. Let's say you have an array of 52 cards. Each number represents one of the cards in the deck. Just throw in the back of your mind, how would you efficiently shuffle the deck? Shuffle the deck. It's a fun little algorithm to make that happen, in a good way. Oh, let's see. I do have two things on my stack I want to talk about, but I also want to take a break. But I also want to hear more questions from you guys. Any other questions before we? Oh, what's the difference between a model and a schema? Oh, that's a good stumper. I'm going to have to probably get more specific. I'm going to have to narrow that down a little bit because on the philosophical level, I'm going to say nothing. A rose by any other name would smell as sweet. If we're going to go Shakespearean. But in the case of Django, we could definitely narrow it down a little bit. I like that, Jared. That's a good definition, I think. So there's definitely some conflation between the two because you could definitely argue like I have a schema but no model. But in the case of Django, the model is very clearly the implementation of this schema. The schema also has another overloaded use within Django, which is the database schema that corresponds to the model that you've implemented in Python. And there it's a little funkier because the database schema doesn't exist until after the model is defined. And in fact, the database schema is automatically generated by Django. So, but let's stick with Jared's. I like that. They're kind of multiple schemas at work here, even though they represent the same thing, because relational databases most definitely have their own schema concept. Uh, let's see. Are we sticking to REST or will we get into GraphQL? I think we'll probably have time to get into GraphQL. I don't want to do it today because it's a little ahead of time. So this is we're teaching this whole Django week a little differently than we've taught it in the past because we have these pre-course videos that cover everything that we would have talked about in lecture normally. So you guys get the lecture stuff out of the way more quickly than previous cohorts. But then it gives us this 2-hour window every day to do Q&A about what was in the videos and about stuff you're working on, the stuff that you get stumped on. So that's really useful. It also allows us to kind of meander through a bunch of different topics of interest, which is useful, I hope, and perhaps get us into things like GraphQL if we have time to do that. So these 2-hour blocks in the morning for this week are going to be more directed by you guys in a way, and I will do my best to answer questions on the spot as well as I can. That said, please provide feedback on how this is all going to your PMs so that I can tune how the days are going and do whatever it is I have to do so you don't get bored. It's also acceptable during this time to actually be working on your stuff, like keeping an ear on me. And if you were stuck on something, like go ahead and hack on it, because this is more Q&A and directed by you guys. And it'll all be recorded anyway, so you can always go back and watch it at 2x speed with my chipmunk voice. All right, what am I doing? Let's see. A server can connect things, can have some kind of CRUD. And what else? A general question via servers. What else can servers do? Connect things. So typically, well, yeah, those are pretty good umbrella topics. So you can connect to them and then you can interface with them to do things. And those are typically the sorts of things that you do. Let me think of some server that's not so cruddy. Does anybody play MUDs, or MMOs? Everybody plays MMOs now. I guess that counts too. So if you're playing GTA 5 online, I don't really tend to think of that as a CRUD interface, but at some level, I guess you're doing that kind of thing. So maybe a more general description of a server would be something that can transmit and receive data. And now that I think about it, there is an implied hierarchy between servers and what we call clients. And typically, you will have many clients connecting to one server. So both the clients and the servers, they both receive and transmit information from one another. So they're kind of the same in that regard. But in terms of hierarchy, there is usually a central server or a collection of central servers. It gets complicated, that many, many clients are connecting to. And the servers are typically considered to be the gatekeepers of the information and the authoritative source on what is true within the system. If you think about a game like Grand Theft Auto 5 and you didn't have a server and all the clients were just connected to each other, there'd be nothing to stop clients from simply lying, right? Be like, hey, I've connected the game. Hi, everybody. I've got $300 billion and all these weapons. And everybody would be like, okay, I guess that's what you got because we don't have anyone to tell us otherwise. So, but if you have a central server, then you log into the game, the server's like, hey, everybody, this is what that guy has. Period. Yeah, Sam, I like that example too of a great server that's providing some functionality there. We're so used to REST and this request response nature of HTTP that sometimes it can be hard to think of different ways servers work, how they stream information back and forth. Like the server we're using right now for this Zoom session, somehow I'm getting data from my camera. It's streaming out over my network to a server someplace, and that server knows everybody who's connected to this room, and it's retransmitting that stream 42 times to different people over the internet. So, perfectly, we're using an example right now of a server that's not particularly cruddy. It's actually kind of amazing. I've been working in tech for a long time, and I don't think a year goes by where I'm not amazed by something. It blows my mind that this stuff actually works. And despite being amazed like that, when it suddenly stops working, I get really irritated. Hmm, maybe I should have more patience with this miraculous future that we are all living in right now. Good old WebRTC. I haven't looked at that in a long time. There must be. I've been trying to work this out for myself for a while now. I don't want to get too philosophical here, but it seems like no matter how good someone's condition in life is, they always have something to complain about. And I'm no exception to that. Same thing happens to me too. Sometimes I have a particularly bad day with a flat tire or something, and then I'm like, well, at least I didn't have to walk for 3 hours to get water. Yeah, there's got to be some psychological reason for that. Remember all the little stuff that goes right, even when you're having a programming day where nothing seems to work out for some reason. Remember all the little things that have gone actually right this day. That's true, but you know what's wrong with utopia? No, not really. I'm sure we'd have something to complain about there too. All right, it's break time. Let's complain about that. I've kept you guys here long enough. I do have a couple other things I want to talk about, but we can easily get that in 45 minutes. All right. Do you guys, every cohort's different. Do you want me to pause the recording during a break or keep the recording running during a break? Stopwatch for sure. Keep the recording going. No preference. All right, cool. Let's do it. I'll catch you guys in five. And grab that coffee or whatever it is. Tea in my case. I'm also a tea drinker. I love coffee, but I can't do the caffeine. Oh. All right, see you in five. Maybe I should have a timer that's a little less cheesy than just going to Google. I mean, look at all these suggestions. All right, are we back? Everybody got the coffee? Everybody's still getting their coffee? Is it just me? Don't leave me here in silence. I need to know that somebody's out there. All right. Mm. So my roommate just got back from working as a ski guide in Chile for a month and a half, and she brought back these snacks. I don't know what they're called. Oh, they taste incredibly bad for you, but they're so good. Mm. Chilean, I don't know what you call them, snacky cake things. All right. Let's see. So the two things I wanted to talk about were what you guys were working on the side of this project, and then also sequel stuff. But I don't know. I want to give you guys more opportunity to direct via questions if you had questions about stuff before I just launch into me talking about things. Sounds like everything's going so far so good. If this week goes by too easily, then subsequent cohorts will get more stuff packed into it. It's a kind of a knife edge that we try to walk where we want to challenge people, but we don't want to overwhelm people. So, and with curriculum iteration, it's always swinging back and forth a bit. And I don't know. What was last week? Was it algorithms? Graphs. Oh, yeah. A tough topic for sure. And we do try to have an ebb and flow of difficulty. Like, it turns out that learning happens best if you have periods of time where you're really working hard at it, followed by like little rest breaks where you're still working but not sprinting all out. So we try to keep this going throughout the curriculum so you guys don't burn out, which is why this week might be a little easier. All right, well, let's see. Let me ask this. Oh, somebody's typing. Give you guys every opportunity to direct the conversation instead of me just lecturing. Typing was happening, but then it stopped. Oh, Thomas. Oh, this is a great question. Why Django? How many web frameworks are there? And then we chose Django out of uh, how many? Let's just pop over to the web frameworks page. I mean, so many. But of course, we're doing this part of the curriculum in Python, so we would use a Python one, right? Out of all of these, why that one? So this is a perfectly valid question. And I'm going to start it off with a little bit of a disclaimer that a lot of these would have been perfectly fine web frameworks to use. But I've got some answers for why Django. It is definitely used a bunch. So it's one of the most popular Python frameworks out there. If you guys are going to find one in the field and you had to bet in the blind what framework it was, Django is a good bet to make, just on a pure number standpoint. So when we choose things to teach, we try to choose things that are practical. That's one of the things that goes into it. Of course, this is the computer science curriculum, so what is deemed practical is a little bit more flexible because we try to teach things that are globally applicable, things that will make you a better developer in general, not just a good Django developer, say. And we don't actually give Django enough time for you to come out of the curriculum and be like, yeah, I'm a top-notch Django developer right now. I mean, look at the amount of time you spent doing the full stack web stuff compared to a week of Django, right? You're not going to get the same coverage this week as you did with full-time web stuff. That said, why do we do it? So a bunch of different reasons. One of them ties into that web of knowledge thing. If you know one framework, that's a good node in your web of knowledge. But hey, if you know two frameworks, then you can start connecting these two things and see how they relate. And importantly, you can start seeing the relative strengths of one versus the other. So you've done a bunch of stuff in Express and you have all that information, and now you're going to do something similar in Django, and you're going to see like, okay, we get the same outcome. We get this REST API, but the way that we've put it together is different. And you're going to come up with a whole list of reasons why you like Django more or why you like Express more. And those will be valid reasons. Some of it will just be like, oh, my opinion is this. I feel better when I'm writing programs with Django, so I like it more. But there could also be technical reasons where you're like, I had this one project and I tried to write it using Django and it turned out to not fit very well. Django was having trouble modeling the data in the way I needed, and Express did a better job at it for this particular project. There's no one framework that's going to do everything better than every other framework. And the reason for that is because doing better depends on the context. It depends on the problem that you're trying to solve. So there are problems out there that Django solves better than Express does. And there are problems out there that Express solves better than Django does. So which tool you use really depends on the problem itself. Now, how do you make that decision? You've got a problem. You're like, okay, what tool do I use to solve this problem? And the only way to know what decision to make there is to have a web of knowledge that compares frameworks and their strengths and weaknesses. So, long-winded way of getting to say, we're teaching Django because it's another framework with a different approach than what you've seen before. And so we're trying to kind of maximize the perspective that you're getting. Now that you're learning Django, you look back on Express and from a different vantage. You're like, okay, we're doing it this way now. Oh yeah, I remember how I did this in Express. And you can see that from a different point of view than you had before just by learning another framework. So that's sort of the general answer for why we're teaching another framework. And then, of course, that's really sort of our main reason. We just want you to experience learning another framework, something that gives you perspective against what you've already learned, something that you can add to your web of knowledge. We want all those things. These Python projects could all do that. But if we're going to choose one of them, why don't we try to be as practical as possible and choose the one that you're most likely to see in the wild ever? So hopefully does that answer the question? That was long-winded. Uh, I tried to make it as concise as possible for the nature of the question. And Django is so opinionated, right? Yeah, so by opinionated, we're kind of saying that Django has a way of wanting to do things. And it's kind of ties into why there's so much boilerplate in it that we have to write out. But if you want to do something radically different, you're like, oh, I don't want to use this whole model structure, then Django's going to be like, I'm not going to help you, because the way we do things is you define a model and I convert that model into SQL for you, restoring it in a SQL database. And you think, well, what if I want to use Mongo instead of a SQL database? Django is going to be like, yeah, no, not so much. I don't want you to really do that. And it is another tool for the toolbox. Yes. That old saying of, if all you know is a hammer. I'm going to tie in a little bit of a soapbox to this, which I don't think I've told you guys. It's hard to remember which people I've told what to, but I may have said this in our little intro speech. But I had a scuba dive instructor who I was asking him about different dive gear, like different dive rigs. There are these different ways of setting up your dive equipment, and these ways are opinionated. There's people who say you should set it up this way because then you won't die, things like that. They're very opinionated about it. And I was asking my dive instructor about, like, well, what do you think? Should I use this system or this system? And my dive instructor is like, people argue about this a lot, but I think that you should just be the best diver possible, no matter what you're diving in. You should be able to grab an old J-valve tank from the 60s and a horse collar and go dive in that with a weight belt and be an excellent diver. And you should be able to use this brand new system with the long hose and your inflatable VC and all the cutting edge stuff and still be a great diver. And I thought that was really good advice in general and applied to programming, even though we all have our opinions about, oh, hey, this language is great. I have more fun programming in it than other languages. We should be able to be excellent developers in any environment and in any language, even if that means stopping and learning a new language along the way. The technique is greater than the gear. Yeah. And if you think about it, a scuba diver who can dive in any gear is more valuable than the scuba diver who can only dive in one outfit. So kind of the same thing. The more flexible you are, the more willing you are to accept a different paradigm than you're used to, because it fits a business need better than the ones you're used to, then the more valuable you'll be as a developer as well. And at first that might seem a little intimidating, like, oh man, I have to learn another framework, yet another framework. But after you do a couple of them, then the next ones become easier and easier and easier. In my mind, like the first programming language you learn is the most difficult. And then the next one you learn is half as difficult as the first one. And the next one you learn is half as difficult again. And after 5 or 6 programming languages, it might sound like a lot, but you'll get there. Then subsequent programming languages, no big deal. Yes, there's no way you're going to avoid learning new stuff. Part of the reason for that is technological progress, but another part is that businesses tend to like to do new things to differentiate themselves from other businesses. So a lot of businesses are going to be like, hey, we want this cool thing that no other business has, nobody's ever made before. Can you build that? Yes, exactly. Uh, it ties into another thing that I will probably reinforce with you guys over and over again, which is it can be really nerve wracking to be presented with a hard problem that you've never seen before and then be put on the spot and say, hey, can we do this? Even for an experienced developer, that can be nerve wracking because the more experience you have, the more likely, the more they up the game, right? They're like, oh, these guys are this is the expert team. We should give them a really incredibly hard problem to solve. And so no matter what level you're at, there's always a problem whose difficulty is n plus one and makes you go like, oh man, how am I going to make this happen? So if you get that feeling, I want you to know, firstly, you're not alone. Even experienced devs see a problem and their eyes get big. There are always problems out there like that. And the thing that you have to remember is that this whole time, you have been learning the skills to figure problems like that out. And so even if you get that feeling at first, because you legitimately don't know how to solve the problem, stop and take a deep breath and remember that you have the skills to figure out how to solve that problem. And then I'll give you another ace in the hole that you can remember for giving estimates like this, or even saying if a problem is possible to solve or not. Because sometimes you do get problems that aren't possible to solve given the constraints of the problem, usually time and money. You can always say, if somebody says, hey, I need this app that uses the camera and does this thing with the special live video effects and the camera on your phone. Can you do that in a web page? How long will it take? So that's a problem. If I heard that, I'd be like, oh man, can I even do this? Like, can we apply live effects in a web page to a camera from the phone? Is this even possible? I don't even know. So the ace in the hole is you can say, I have to do a little bit of research to let you know how long it will take to implement that. And then I've done this so many times. You can give an estimate for how long it'll take you to get the estimate. You'd be like, I should be able to give you an estimate for how long it would take to make the thing in uh, 4 hours. So it gives you 4 hours of research time to go try to figure out if it's doable and stuff like that. So people typically understand that just because you're the computer guy doesn't mean that you know everything off the top of your head and that some research has to be done. The field is gigantic. Even people who work in sales kind of have an inkling that the amount of knowledge out there is positively mind blowing. Lifelong learning is, yeah, it's tough. It's for the longest time, it's in the history of work, if you think about it, for as long as work has existed, people have typically had a specialty that they would develop and they would stay there. And for life, they would stay there. Generationally, they would stay there. I mean, you still have last names floating around like Miller and Brewer and Cooper. Like these are all names that mean it's a business, right? It's work. And the work has been so entrenched as being a lifelong single thing that you did that it became people's last names that persist to this day. And back in the 60s and 70s, I'm going to go work for General Electric and I'm going to be there for 30 years and get my pension and all that stuff. Even then it was much the same. Like one of my older uncles worked at a company like that, and if you were to ask him what he was going to do for his second career, he'd be like, second career, what are you talking about? That's a thing? But now everything's different. Now people do have second careers and third careers over the course of their lives, and kind of amazing to think about. Uh, some of you may be intimidated by the idea that I have to keep learning stuff, but I would encourage you to change your thinking just a little bit from being this endless stream of things you have to pick up. I prefer to think of it as like a massive table full of endless desserts that I get to choose from, and I'll never run out. It keeps it interesting. If you told me I had to do the same job for 20 years, I feel bad just saying those words. Ah, I'd get so bored. Let's see, jumping ahead a little bit for day one of today's repo. Yes, so the task for day two will be the afternoon today. So right after this, I will post another collection of videos, which are the same ones on Training Kit, and then we'll range ahead in that way. Another analogy I have for that feeling of being unsettled by a new task that you've never done before, it's sometimes it feels like I'm in this endless ocean of new tasks. And I'm treading water there, and I'm like, oh, geez, what am I going to do with this endless ocean out there forever? I'm treading water in the middle of it. But then I remember that I've learned how to swim, and then I can just swim to the next problem, and swim to the next problem, and swim to the next problem. It's been pretty rare that something's come across my desk that I was not able to actually solve. And it's been extremely common that stuff has come across my desk where I wasn't sure I could solve it at first. So lots of times stuff would come across and I'd be like, I don't know, man. And then I'd find some way to do it. The internet is amazing now. I'm so happy that all of you have Google at your disposal and YouTube at your disposal. It makes everything so much easier. Stack Overflow is just incredible. You have sort of the opposite problem that I had in school, where for me, there was a dearth of information. But now you all have so much information out there. You have to decide which parts of it are good. You have to sift through all the chaff to find the wheat. All right, enough soapboxing here. My other question for you guys, along with the notes app that the videos are kind of covering, what I want you to also do is either make another completely separate app with Start app, or just add another model to that existing app. So modeling some other kind of information besides personal notes. So I was going to ask, what did you guys come up with for other types of information that you wanted to model? User info. Be advised that Django does have its own auth user table in there, but contact information. I don't know what Django swap is. That sounds familiar, but I don't know what it is. Star Wars API. Nice. What else? What else did people put together? Surely somebody else has done something. Or if you haven't done it, what sort of data would you like to model? I have my own favorite data. Does anybody else have? Nobody else has their own favorite data type. I'm a color schemes. Yeah. See, I love hearing these because it's stuff that I get locked in my own little data world, and I don't think about all the different types of things that people would model. Color schemes, I like it. So for me personally, I'm all geospatial. I like geographic data. So like latitudes, longitudes, waypoints, areas, stuff like that. So that's always what I model when I'm putting stuff together. That or motorcycle information of some kind. Anybody else? What other kind of data should we model? Somebody who hasn't said something yet. Surely there's somebody out there. I got 42 people. More brainstorming. What other models? What other data can we represent in there? There's so much stuff can be represented. Movies. I love it. Movie data. We're going to put a REST endpoint here for uh, the notes, but why not a REST endpoint with movie data? I guarantee you IMDb has some kind of massive database on the back end that you can make movie requests against for actors in the movies an actor has made, and so on. Grateful Dead locations. Yeah. I guarantee, Alex, you're the first person who's just suggested that in the history of Lambda School in all my asking these questions. I love it. But yeah, like Mark says, it's each of us we have our own experiences and our own lens that we see the world through. And so, of course, when we come up with ideas, they're ideas that we're making through this lens, and we can try to broaden our own personal experience so that we have a broader view of the world, and that makes us more flexible as developers to do that. But at the same time, it's a famous quote. I don't remember who made it. It was something along the lines of no matter how smart you are, you cannot come up with a list of things that would not occur to you. So seeing everybody else's ideas out here really helps, broaden my perspective on all the different types of data that people are interested in seeing. Man, speaking of motorcycle, I did do some motorcycle riding over the weekend, some really sandy terrain, and my legs are really sore from it. And I've got a standing workstation here in space. I think it would be 0G out here, but apparently it's not. My quads are killing me. Oh yeah, that windy map is so cool. Good thought experiment. How many APIs would be used, and what kinds of APIs? What do you guys think? See if we can brainstorm what APIs must have been put forward in this thing. Oh, and there was a question about licenses I totally ignored. I should talk about that too. Let's do that and then licenses. Looks like around me there's not so much wind. Oh, that zoomed in fast. Yeah, so we've got like radar data, wind data, gusts. So there's probably APIs for gathering all this information from a web standpoint. But what other data can we see here? There's a version of this that's 3D, isn't there? Like a globe. Looks like the API might have historic data in it as well. We'll jump back in time. On the left, I can zoom out of the surface. Oh, no, this is something else. My other left. Yeah, this is my left. Like in the hamburger menu or elsewhere? Am I just missing it? Oh yeah, this thing. So I'm going up and oh man, I didn't even know it could do this. This is how do we have all this data? How do we have this? What kind of sensors do we use? So here we are at flight level 240, 7,000 meters elevation. And this is what the winds are like. That's incredible. It's truly incredible. Let's see, we probably also got an API for getting this map data because clearly we're showing a map here as well. I wonder where that comes from. So I live in Bend, which is why I keep zooming in on it. All right, so this data comes from OpenStreetMap. I know this to be true because I work on OpenStreetMap data, and so I recognize all this stuff. So there's another API that's used. There's probably also a graphics API that this site is using to get all this stuff drawn. There's a graphics library called D3. This this feels kind of D3 like to me. So D3 has its own API for getting stuff done, and it would be good at doing things like drawing these wind particles and stuff like that. And then there might be another API that's being used to show all these different layers. I don't know. I'm speculating. More layers. Holy cow. Oh, waves. Wave swell. I see stuff like this and I think this is a really an impressive amount of work to bring all this together into this beautiful thing. So I know with wave swell, I know we've got buoys out there that measure like the period of the waves and the height of the waves and transmit that data back to the mainland. But I don't know if we have any like space-based things for doing that. Yeah, it's mind-blowing that this is free. I always have weird ideas about like, what if you could take this website back in time and show it to Ferdinand Magellan? What would he think? The amount of data we have at our disposal right now is mind-blowingly huge. It's there's some figure floating around like the amount of data created in the last 4 years is greater than the amount of data created in all the years before that, and that number is just getting smaller and smaller and smaller. We're generating so much data so fast. Let's see, I should have just pulled down the hamburger menu, huh? Show in 3D mode. Yes. So probably some other API they're using to do 3D rendering. Man, does this still use OpenStreetMap data? That's going to weird me out. No, it does not. I can't zoom in more than this. So they've got some shoreline data and some big lake data, but that looks like about it. There's this whole branch of mathematics called interpolation, which means trying to decide between two data points what the data points in between those would be. Even if you don't actually have that data, you try to figure out what it likely is. So I'm sure a lot of interpolation, really complicated interpolation is happening here because clearly we don't have wind sensors carpeting the globe at every cubic meter of atmosphere. So there are probably a few wind sensors here and there, and they use that to try to figure out what the rest of the wind is doing. I still don't understand how we have, like out here in the doldrums, how do we have stuff out there? How do we know what that is? I don't know. Humans can be pretty awesome sometimes. You guys have to admit, sometimes we do pretty incredible things. All right. So yeah, lots of APIs used for this one, especially when you pull out the more layers thing. Let's see, I was using an API once for a job that got flight delay information. There's an API for that. So you could go look up for an airport, what's the general flight delay status here, and what individual flights are delayed. Using that information. APIs for everything. How high does this go? 45,000 feet. Leaflet. Oh, I love it. Leaflet is a great map API. It interfaces with all kinds of maps on the back end, notably OpenStreetMap. There's a meetup here in town, the Map Time meetup, where we talk about map stuff and map programming. Yeah, I like Leaflet. In my less than 1 minute I have remaining, I saw that question go by about licenses. And oh yeah, transportation data, real time for sure. Yep. You go to the Bay Area, it'll say next bus in 12 minutes. And because it knows, there's an app called Next Bus, I think, actually, that does the same thing. So they're probably all calling the same API to make it happen. With the licenses, I'm not a lawyer, so if you're just doing something on the side that's your own personal thing, if you're not making any money with it, then you're in pretty good shape for using any of the open source licenses. If you are making money, now you have to read some fine print and determine if you're allowed to make money with this, using this thing with its particular license. Usually this isn't a practical concern until large amounts of money happen. But if you're at work, this is the important part. If you're working for somebody, find out from a higher up what you can and cannot use. Some businesses are very restrictive on what types of open source licenses they'll allow. And so you'll want to get clearance from your manager or somebody higher up saying, yes, it's okay to use that thing. Clearly, like Facebook's API, Google's API, these things are meant to be used for sure. Like they want you to use them. So if your boss is like, hey, I need you to implement this Facebook feature, you can be pretty confident that yes, using the Facebook API is okay, regardless of what the license says. The license is going to say it's okay. But for other people's software stuff, especially GNU software, if you were deciding to use some of that GNU license software, companies get a little bit antsy about it. So short answer, find out from higher up if a particular open source license or open source software you want to use is acceptable to that company. The last thing you want to find out is months after completion, oh, hey, we can't use that. And now we have to re-implement that chunk of functionality on our own. The CYA principle, anybody heard of that? Yeah. Yep. The Street View API charges over a certain amount. This is another good thing to warn people about. Like I've gone into projects and they've said, hey, we want to use the Google Street View API or the Maps API or whatever. And I'll just tell them, I'm like, it's great as long as our volume is this, but as soon as it goes over this, then you guys are going to owe this much money. So full disclosure, here's how that works. And then they can make the decision, oh yeah, we'll pay that extra money, or we'll make sure our volume doesn't go that high. Stuff like that. Yeah, and OpenStreetMap too, they changed their license as well partway through, and that was a big deal. The idea with OpenStreetMap is that the data is free to use, even commercially. And at first it wasn't fully free to use, even commercially. There was sort of a give back portion of the license, and then it was turned out to be problematic, so they changed the license. But we had all this data that other people had put into OpenStreetMap on the old license, and some of these people didn't like the new license. They weren't okay with their data being used in that way. And so there was this crazy thing where OpenStreetMap got everybody they could to agree with the terms of the new license. And if you were a contributor and you agreed with the new terms, then great, all your data stayed in the database. But for the people who did not agree to the new terms, their data was deleted because they didn't agree to the new terms. And it was deleted, and people just had to recreate it under the new terms. Changing licenses can be a big deal. But again, I'm not a lawyer. Talk to your boss. Can't go wrong. All right, gang, I've kept you too long. We're 4 minutes over. I will post the next set of videos right now, and then that'll get us farther into our Django project. If you did not implement your own model alongside of the notes model, please do that. Come up with something you want to model, either something that you like or something that you saw go by, and get that going in parallel. I'm glad. I'm glad it was fun chatting. And like I said at the beginning, this was a more of a chatty type of lecture. So for this week, given that all the lecture material is in these pre-recorded videos and we're kind of doing the lecture time more like this, please, I highly value your feedback on that, for how informative it is, how fun it is, how useful it is, how much a waste of time it is, and so on. So the goal for end of day will be to have implemented all the stuff that the videos do, the stuff I'm about to post for you. And also, in parallel to that, within the same project, if you want, whatever is easiest, model your own data and keep that up to speed as well with where the videos are at. And as you do this stuff, maybe I'll put this in as an additional goal. As you do this stuff, keep track of the questions you have. So if you get stuck, sure, go to the help channel. But if you have questions that might be good to talk about during lecture, like bank those up and then we'll talk about them in the morning. That'll give us more stuff to talk about. Even if the question isn't exactly on topic, if it's just peripherally, that word gave me trouble right there. If it's just related in that way, that's good too. Oh, yes, Mark, thank you for that graph. I love it. This thing's awesome. All right, gang. Great chatting with you. I'll post those videos, and I don't think they're that long. I think it's under an hour of stuff, so I hope. If any of them go super long, please tell me. I just haven't done the math yet. I try to keep them short and bite-sized pieces. Like, if I can keep them around 10 minutes each, I'm happy. Any last minute, I was going to say last words. That's grim. Any last minute words? Time to go get a burrito. Maybe run around, make my legs less sore. I don't dance. This is me just trying to make my legs stop hurting. All right, gang. Have a good lunch. Keep the questions coming. Bank up questions for tomorrow. I'll post those videos right now. And I'll catch you all later on. See ya.